Hi, before we get into this particular piece of content, which is going to be something completely unique and new that I've never actually released before, I'm trying this out. It'll be, I think it'll be an interesting and positive addition to several of you, but probably not the majority of you. This particular piece of content is something that I shot live over Instagram and YouTube with my good friend, Alex Shaves, who is getting his PhD in bioenergetics. Now, initially, I'd thought about doing this piece of content in terms of having it well edited, kind of like I do for my examine videos. But after some thought, those videos don't do that well in terms of them being really lengthy. This particular interview or kind of discussion is going to be 45 minutes to an hour long, and most people don't really stick around for that full time. So instead of spending 10 to 12 hours of my life editing this particular piece of content, I'm going to have the papers linked that we discuss. The first paper is discussing the ketogenic diet, and the second paper, which I'll probably have in an additional different video, is discussing caffeine and its impact on hypertrophy, muscular hypertrophy. And the first one is on the ketogenic diet and lifting performance. So if you want to know the information that we discuss, then you can just wait for the examine pieces to come out, because they'll be more condensed, and of course they'll have the good editing and things of that nature, as well as the different extract pieces for the most important information. So wait for that. If you're not interested in learning how to dissect a paper, really go through the discussion of what are the positives, what are the negatives of a paper, beyond what the examine series does. If you really want to be able to look figure by figure with two people that have experience looking at papers and really dissecting the different papers and whatnot, and the different figures, and how, different interpretations and kind of some of the nuances that I definitely miss out or cut out on the examine series, then this journal club format is exactly for you. But if you don't have the patience, or you just want the answer, this is not for you. Okay, let me just state that very clearly. This is not for you. So, no hard feelings. I certainly understand everybody has their different preferences, but this just isn't for people who don't want this lengthy form of information. They're not interested in the process of how we go about getting to the conclusions that we do. They just want the conclusions, which I completely get that. And I will have specific content describing the conclusions that we got to. But how we got there is this piece of content. So the journal club, and I think it's probably something that I'm going to do going forward. So while we have the examine pieces, which are far more polished, and of course I've got the extracts, which are just small snippets of everything, the examine pieces, and what now this is going to be called the journal club. There's a small group of individuals that seem to be really interested in going through this long form and really having this really raw view of how we go about reading some of this research. So anytime I'm going to be covering an examine paper, I think what I'm going to do is do a live broadcast where you can chime in with your points, and we can right on the spot, discuss the paper and some of the critiques and some of the positives, so that you get an access to really be able to go through just like a journal club. And we do this in academic settings all the time, where a group of individuals read a paper and then we dissect it and really discuss it in depth. Now, of course, those can be anywhere from like 20 minutes to like several hours. So clearly that's not going to be for everybody. But again, don't worry, you're never going to miss out on any of the actual information when it comes to the conclusions that we come to. It's just for those few individuals that are real hardcore science nerds and really want to know biology and nutrition and really engage with me and really go through this whole process. So should be a lot of fun for those individuals that are interested. And again, if you don't care about long form, really long form format, and you don't want to follow figure by figure, which again, I'll have both papers linked down below, then that's perfectly okay. I will have everything for you at any rate. Anyways, okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this Journal Club episode, the very first one with Alex Shaves. Let's get into it. So with that out of the way, my name's Nicholas Verhoeven. If you're completely new to Physionic, I'm a PhD student in molecular medicine. I have my master's in exercise physiology from this institution right here that I'm recording from, which I have the pleasure of visiting again. And the guests that I have today, do you want to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your credentials?
Sure. My name is Alex Shaves. I'm also a PhD student at East Carolina University, where we're recording from. I am currently getting my PhD in bioenergetics and exercise science. I have done my master's. I completed my master's at the University of Illinois at Chicago in kinesiology as well. And then before that, I completed my bachelor's degree in exercise science at Salisbury University, which is a small school in the Eastern Shore of Maryland.
Yeah, so and your PhD is in bioenergetics, right?
Yes.
Or you're getting your PhD. Mm-hmm. Actually, he just finished his candidacy, so when you go from in a PhD, you go from PhD student to PhD candidate, mm-hmm. which is essentially you're done with your classes and all you have to do is finish. All you have to do is finish your research and do grants and all that fun stuff. So it's essentially setting you up for research. So congrats on that. The reason why I'm really excited to bring Alec on is, one, because when I first met him, I was really impressed by just how intelligent he was, and he is, and how smart he is. So I'm excited in that regard, but also just having a PhD that's specific to metabolism, I think is really awesome, because I've got a lot of background in metabolism, but that's not like my degree's more general. And yours is far more metabolism based. So the second paper is really going to be, I think, what you're most interested in. But without further ado, let's jump into the first paper. The first paper is going to be covering the ketogenic diet. So if you are listening to this, watching this live, I have it linked. If you're on Instagram, you're going to have to go to YouTube, or I've got it in my bio. You can find it there as well. I have the papers linked. You can download those. Again, they're completely open to you, so you can read the entire paper as we're going through it. The idea is that I'm going to introduce each paper, both papers, and then we're going to go over the methods a little bit and like how they went about discovering what they wanted to discover. And then from there, we're going to go figure by figure. We're going to skip a few graphs and things of that nature, which are a little more involved, but we're going to try and do our best to explain what's going on in each figure, and then kind of our interpretation. Then at the end, hopefully we'll have a conclusion. And if you'd like to chime in with the chat, then come on over to YouTube, where I will hopefully have some time to read through and figure out what interpretations you guys have, or if you guys just have questions in general that you want answered along the way, especially near the conclusion time. Okay, so with that said, the first paper is called A Low Carbohydrate Ketogenic Diet, which is kind of redundant, but reduces body mass without compromising performance in powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting athletes. Now, of course, the title immediately tells you that there's going to be no compromise in performance, but as we know in science, different interpretations can come really at any time, and we both have had our issues with both of these papers for a variety of reasons. So what they wanted to know is, does the ketogenic diet negatively affect or positively affect, whatever way, it's going to have some sort of effect on lifting performance? So I think that just about...
Yes, it does. And the one thing I did like that they showed in the introduction was the application for this. So specifically for weightlifters and powerlifters who have to adhere to specific weight classes, figuring out ways to cut weight without compromising performance too much in a short period of time is of the highest benefit. Like, you need to figure out a way to do that, and these diets in which you're going on massive calorie crashes don't seem to be the way to do it, because it's also associated with a massive decrease in performance. So this is just trying to figure out if the ketogenic diet is an alternative to that, where you're not going to see that drastic decrease in performance, but still see some of the weight loss effects right before a competition, so you can fit into whatever weight class you want.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really good way to just summarize it. Okay, so the methods, how they went about it. I've got a few notes here. The methods they used, so they had 12 participants, and actually they've got it summarized in figure 1. So figure 1 gives you an idea of how they went about this study, essentially. And they had 16 initially that they recruited, or that they assessed were eligible, and then they excluded 2 because they didn't meet particular criteria, and then they had 14 which they randomized, but they ended the study with 12, meaning that 2 of them dropped out for various reasons. It doesn't matter too much, maybe an exclusion criteria, whatever it might be, or sickness, or it could be anything. So it's a crossover design study. Do you want to explain what that is roughly?
Sure. Pretty much the simplest way to put it is that each person serves as their own control. So each person is compared to themselves. So they're doing 2 different interventions here. So the ketogenic diet, and then they also have like the normal feeding diet that they typically consume. And the person so what ends up happening is the person is randomized into either starting with the ketogenic or starting with the normal diet, and then all the results are compared to their own control, or that normal diet control that they were using.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
And by by having it be randomized, it reduces the order effect. So if you're ketogenic first, that could potentially have a spillover effect into when you then go back on your normal diet, and vice versa. So if you start with a normal diet, the spillover effect on the ketogenic diet following. So by having it randomized and people kind of mix and match, that reduces that effect. Because if there is an effect, then all of it will be washed out and you won't see any significant differences at the end.
Yeah, that's really well explained. Probably better than I could do it. So they had 3 months on each diet, 3 months on the ketogenic diet, then they had a 2-week washout period. And then the washout period was essentially just them returning to whatever diet that they were on before. And that should be enough time to essentially because the ketogenic diet, if you're doing it properly, should have some profound effects on your metabolism, just in terms of fat oxidation and things of that nature, which we'll probably get into later on. And then after those 2 weeks, they had 3 months on the other diet. So again, that crossover design. The ketogenic diet was defined by, and is typically defined by, something like 5% or less of carbohydrates, or 10% or less of carbohydrates.
Yeah, it varies from what I've seen, but yeah.
Yeah, but essentially what you really want to see is an increase in ketones. Mm-hmm. And we'll definitely be getting into that later on. So the lifters themselves were, I wouldn't necessarily call them elite lifters, but they were lifters that had competition experience for at least, I think, a year. I think that's what they had written down. I guess it was a year.
Yeah. They were advanced or experienced lifters. So.
Right. And this is weightlifters and powerlifters. So weightlifters would be something like Olympic lifting, as I understand it.
Yes.
And powerlifting would be kind of sitting, not necessarily, but for the most part, sticking to that 1, 3, 5 rep range, kind of a lower rep range. Yeah,
they're pretty much, they're very similar, just the lifts they're performing are different. And if I can just jump on that, there is a lot of people when they talk about powerlifting versus Olympic lifting, it really should be, or weightlifting really should be opposite, because weightlifting should be powerlifting because it requires a lot more power to do the lift, whereas powerlifting, you're moving a very heavy weight slow, so by the basic pure definition of power, it's not really powerlifting.
Right.
But anyway, that's a whole nother.
No, I've never actually thought about that before, but it's absolutely true.
It's a pretty bad misnomer.
It's more like strength lifting in a minute.
Well, they should just be switched. Like weightlifting should be powerlifting, powerlifting should be weightlifting.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, they consumed ad libitum for both diets, so that means that they did not control for calories specifically. Yep. So you were just placed on this diet, ketogenic or the other, what was it called? UD, I think, something like that?
Yeah, it pretty much was just a standard, like whatever their normal diet pattern was.
Like a standard diet or the ketogenic diet. And standard diet was a more high carb, kind of normal diet, and the ketogenic diet, as I explained, is low carbohydrate, tends to be moderate protein, tends to be high fat, a dietary fat. So they were allowed to consume as much as they wanted from then on. Just a quick reminder again, Instagram, YouTube, if you're listening to this or watching this, the papers are linked on YouTube. I actually have them linked on Instagram as well. If you'd like to jump in for the chat, then jump in on YouTube because I can't see the Instagram chat. We'll be taking questions if you have any kind of near the end of discussing each of these papers. There are 2 papers that we're going to be going over. This one is the ketogenic diet on lifting performance. I'll link that again on YouTube. Okay, so yeah, so they ate as much as they wanted to. They recorded their diet on MyFitnessPal, which a lot of people do. I've been doing it for like 2,000 days straight.
That's a good app, yep.
Holla! And then they took lifting measures, obviously, like 1 rep max and things like that. And we'll get into what exactly that is, as well as blood markers. They took a few different measures to figure out like health markers and things of that nature, what's going on. And they took it at baseline, so right when the study began, as well as 3 months, so after the first group had run through their diet, or they had run through their diet in general, and then after the 6-month period, so after the study was finished. Okay, so do you want to add anything to the methods, anything in particular, before we jump into the results?
No, I think that about covers it. Pretty much testing baseline, then post. And then, obviously training was kept pretty much similar compared to what the athlete was typically doing, so nothing standardized there. So really, but that again doesn't matter because each person is their own control. So the stuff they were doing during the ketogenic diet in terms of training is the exact same thing, or supposed to be the exact same thing they were going to be doing during their usual diet. So no issues there. I think that's a decent design and kind of takes advantage of the hectic life and the typical plan that these lifters have.
Yeah, okay. So the first step in the results, let's see, table 1. Yeah, table 1. I've got a few notes here. Most of the things are pretty typical, what you would see. So here they're looking at the general composition of the diets, right? So the amount of fats, the amount of carbohydrates, the amount of protein, which makes sense. They want to do that mainly because they want to show to the reader, hey, we really did have them in a ketogenic diet. Personally, I'm never convinced by that, to be honest with you. I would need to know, and they do put percentages as well, which is great, and they put the absolute values in terms of just the grams, the amount of each macronutrient that they consume, but it's going to come down to the ketones. Do they have elevated ketones? And then of course they reported how much they actually ate. So although they didn't actually control for the calories, they didn't tell them, hey, you need to consume 2,200 calories or whatever it might be. What they did was they actually still checked how much everybody ate in total. Did you find anything in here that you thought was kind of off-putting, or anything that you found interesting?
No, for that I think it was what you'd expect from these typical diets. The one thing here, ketogenic and a lot of like the low carb diets usually don't include as much protein as a percentage base as I would like them to, but just because if the main goal is weight loss but yet still performance, but that's a whole different discussion. But yeah, and then the other thing that's again interesting and cool is that both were ad libitum, but the energy intake was not significantly different between the groups, which is important, and also kind of interesting because one of the things that a lot of the ketogenic experts or people that push a ketogenic diet or low carb diet is that it's supposed to be much more satiating. So you can get, or you can pretty much eat less but still feel full. So in doing so, you're actually going to be consuming a lot less calories. But in this case, that wasn't what happened. They ended up eating the exact same amount.
Yeah, that's definitely a really good observation. And they did report the energy intake in kilojoules, which is more of kind of a European standard, but you can easily convert that to calories. I've got that in the guide. If you click on the link, you can see that on the guide that you can see this conversion. You just divide it by 4.18 and you'll get calories from kilojoules. And the calories were 2,060 for the UD, which is the ordinary diet, the normal diet, and then 2,074 calories for the keto diet. So not a statistically or even like relevant difference between the two. Going back to protein, you mentioned that protein sometimes is lower for the ketogenic group, and I'm actually concerned a little bit here because typically you want moderate protein. So I don't know if like relative to their total diet, if this is considered moderate protein. Like the percentage is about 20%, which is around where you want to be, 15-20% when it comes to moderate or slightly low protein. So what I liked is the fact that they had the same amount of protein. So whatever effect you're going to get, it's not going to come from having more protein in the normal diet condition. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
But the problem with that is that if protein is too high, that can actually pull you out of a ketogenic state. So that's why ketones, specifically looking at ketones, is really important to actually determine if somebody was in a ketogenic state. So again, I keep teasing that, but it's something that's actually going to be really important later on. But other than that, it seems pretty standard. Okay, moving on to table 2. Table 2 is, well, do you want to explain this one?
Yeah, so table 2 is pretty much just looking at the overall training load and what each lifter was able to do while on both diets. Important thing being is they wanted to show that on either diet, there shouldn't be any differences in what the lifter can actually handle. And that's extremely important when considering a low-carb diet, considering that these are lifters that are doing high-intensity exercise. So a lot of their activity is going to be is going to utilize the glycolytic system. So it's going to use a lot of glycogen and glucose for energy production. So if you start restricting that, there's a chance that performance can suffer. But what this is showing, at least, is that these lifters seem to be able to maintain the same amount of volume between both diets, which is very, very important.
Yeah, and glucose being like blood sugar, carbohydrates essentially, usually considered coming from carbohydrates. And volume, how would you define volume?
So volume is pretty much the total amount of, well, depending on like what if you're including weight or not, but usually it's the total amount of work and reps that you're doing. And that's combined with the amount of weight that you're actually using for those reps. So pretty much what they're saying is how much weight you're lifting and how much movement you're doing in a specific session, and then how that compounds for week and then month and year.
Okay, great. Yeah, so here you don't see any relevant differences. You don't see any statistically significant differences, and that's definitely comforting to see because yeah, I mean, that's probably the first thing you'd want to look at.
Yep.
If on a ketogenic diet, do you see any differences in terms of the amount of time? They've got sessions per week, they've got minutes of actual work, of training time, and then they've got the load itself, which is essentially volume. Yep. So no differences between the groups. Okay, anything to add?
No, I mean, one of the biggest things that whenever you're talking about strength conditioning, one of the biggest things you always think about with an athlete is the person that can train harder for longer is probably going to be the better athlete. So the same applies here. So pretty much if either diet had an advantage in that respect, being able to allow each athlete to train harder or longer, or harder and longer harder and longer, obviously, that would obviously have an effect on what the outcomes were going to be in their testing performance after each intervention. But again, because there was no difference, that's a good check that you can kind of put off there, so that it's any differences you're seeing in performance were not due to the actual training stimulus they underwent during those 3-month periods.
Yeah, exactly. And added to that, like honestly, if they stopped the study right there, they could technically jump to the conclusion that they did in the title, but there's a lot more nuance to a lot of this stuff that people don't consider. And that's what we really want to delve into.
Yeah.
So table 3, let's jump into that a little bit, because here we see some differences. I'm going to run through the list real quick of some of the definitions here so you guys understand what we're talking about. So body mass obviously is just the total mass, the total weight of the individual. You've got, then they break that up between fat mass and lean mass. Of course, fat mass is fat, right? Lean mass is like bone tissue, but also skeletal muscle tissue and smooth muscle tissue, that kind of stuff. 1 rep max, 1 RM is kind of their measure of strength that they're getting out of these individuals. RMR is resting metabolic rate, so that's the metabolism that you have when you're not active whatsoever, you're not moving in any regard. Measured RQ, so respiratory quotient, which is something a lot of exercise physiologists use to determine if the body, the total body, is more in a fat burning mode or a glucose carbohydrate burning mode. So if it is low, which 0.7 would be considered low, that'd be like incredibly low, that is more fat burning. And if you are high, if you are around 0.9 or even 1, then you are more carbohydrate burning. And we'll get into that a little bit. And then they've got measures, when they took blood samples, they had measures for glucose, potassium, and sodium, just to see if there are any differences there. So did you see anything here that kind of jumped out to you?
So I mean, and we'll talk. Well, I guess we'll talk about body mass, fat mass, and lean mass on the next thing, because they show that with the ketogenic diet, they dropped body mass in total.
Yeah.
But the things that I was curious about, and I wish they kind of delved into a little bit more, is RMR, for example. So there was no real change there between the ketogenic diet, which is another thing that some people postulate as to why you lose more weight while on a ketogenic diet, because it can affect your resting energy expenditure, the caloric effect of the food, and things like that.
Yeah.
So that wasn't changed at all. The RQ wasn't changed, which is, I guess, at rest shouldn't be surprising. But when these people start exercising, because on a ketogenic diet you should be more fat adapted, so you should be able to metabolize, your ability to metabolize fat should be higher. You would expect you're able to keep your RER for lower for even at higher intensity. So you're able to rely more on fat as an energy substrate versus carbohydrates. But at rest here, that wasn't changed between the groups. And then glucose, you might see with the ketogenic diet, you might see a drop in glucose, I guess more early on, but since this is following a 3-month period, they've already adapted that point, and blood glucose has normalized out. And then potassium and sodium are, just showing that these people are not in a whatever you call it. Their electrolyte balance is normal, pretty much.
Yeah, right. Which certainly can be a danger if people have.
If they're like not hypokalemic.
Yeah, I actually have somebody I know is I think they have hypokalemia, which is a real issue. It's more an issue for your heart.
Yeah.
This is kind of a side note, but it is more of an issue for your heart, because then your heart can't exchange these different ions, and then you have essentially heart failure because you don't have enough potassium or sodium. But before anybody jumps away from this podcast thinking that they need to consume mass quantities of potassium and sodium, you also don't want a whole lot of them, and your body's really good at regulating, making sure that they're in a tight range. So honestly, I have nothing really to add here. Oh, I guess the one thing I would add, which isn't really that much of an addition, but the 1 rep max strength wasn't different between, or at least not statistically different between the 2 time points that they had, the baseline, and between the normal and the ketogenic diet.
Yeah, these guys really aren't going up too much. terms of progression, it's not really there.
No.
We'll call this a maintenance phase.
Yeah, we'll call it a maintenance phase. Yeah, for sure. They didn't gain a whole lot of weight, and may have reduced their weight some. Okay, so let's move on to table 4. So table 4. Oh, wrong one. Okay, table 4. That is the next one, right? Okay. Yeah, figure 2 is the last one. Okay, so table 4. Here they're essentially comparing the normal diet or the ketogenic diet to the baseline, and then they're trying to find the difference between those two states. And here there are some significant differences. You find some differences between the low-carb ketogenic diet and the normal diet, and you see a decrease. So, 3.26? I don't even know what. I guess that's not even a unit, is it? For the mean difference between low carb and UD or normal diet. I think all they're trying to do there is just illustrate that there is a difference, and that it's statistically significantly different because. So you see a difference in the total mass. So that could be fat mass, that could be lean mass, but most likely it's going to be fat mass or water mass. There is a difference between the low carb group and the normal dieting group. Yep. Now then they wanted to investigate the lean mass, and here again, same thing, right? So you see a statistically significant decrease or change, I guess I should say, between the low carb group, the ketogenic group, and the normal diet group.
Yeah. And depending on, like you said, what the units are for this, the majority of the mass loss that you saw on the top of the table there is mostly contributed by lean mass, because it's a drop in 2.26 versus a total drop a drop in total mass of 3.26. So most of that was coming specifically from lean mass.
Yeah. And to be completely honest, I don't know exactly how to read that. If that's just a difference. Now, I guess it is a drop, because if it were a difference, just a difference. Yeah, if it's positive, then it's just going to be an increase from one condition to the other condition.
I think it might just be kgs, if anything.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that's what they've got listed here, lean mass, and mass. Next to it, they've got kilograms. Okay, so essentially there's just a significant difference between the keto group and the normal diet group in both, if that's total mass or if that's in lean mass.
Yep.
And here, the figure 2 is actually where you actually see some of those differences. And this is a really interesting figure, because here they're not just showing you the averages of the entire groups. So where you have one group and you just compare that to another group like they did in the last table, what they're actually showing here is the individual points. So how did these people shift from like one group to the other group? Like when they were on the ketogenic diet, how did that change for that particular individual? Now, you don't want to read into that too much, because what's funny is you can actually see some people are completely divergent from the rest of the groups. But I think this is an incredibly telling figure, because most people, when they think of like an N of 1, right? When you think of a case study, people sometimes might put a lot of emphasis on anecdote. This is a perfect example right here of why you don't want to put emphasis on an anecdote, because you could be that one. If you look at, even there's several, like if you look at, lifting performance percent, you have 3 or 4 individuals that go up while the rest of them go down in terms of the change. But then they've got these black bars which represent the total. So for everybody kind of put together, what is the difference? And that's kind of really what you want to focus on, but it's still really telling and interesting to see the difference between the individual points. So for total body weight, largely you saw a slight increase with the normal diet. So they've got it listed at the very bottom under C. They've got UD for the normal diet and then LCKD for low carb ketogenic diet. And you largely see a decrease with the ketogenic diet in total body weight, but you see an increase with the normal diet. And then from there, what's always great is if they start to tease out the differences between, okay, so then what's contributing to that change in body weight? So the next figure, B, they look at lean mass. So they want to look at muscle mass, bone mass, again, smooth muscle, all that stuff, essentially non-adipose tissue, non-fat mass. And here, again, you mentioned this in the last table, that you see a decrease in lean mass with the ketogenic group. I mean, it's not, kilograms, that's a decent amount, right?
Yeah.
That's 2.2 pounds per kilogram.
Yep.
So you're seeing a pretty significant decrease in the difference between the normal carbohydrate group and the low carbohydrate group.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing this over, it's over a few month period of time, so it's not that drastic. And the other thing too is you got to also account for just random variations and water weight, which we can talk about later.
Yeah.
And how much they consumed the day before, and how they came in. So there's a lot of other factors that play into it. So if you really looked at it and accounted for the natural variation or error that exists in weight scales, it's not that drastic, but it still is something to ponder.
Well, actually, let's touch on water weight for a second, because that's what I was thinking about too. Do you want to expound on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So with the ketogenic diet, as we mentioned before, the biggest thing is glucose. You're cutting it out and you're replacing it pretty much with fat. So with that in mind, there's a few things that happen to our bodies. One of which is that glycogen storage. So when we store glucose in our body, its storage form is called glycogen. And glycogen is really cool because it's this giant molecule, but it holds on to water really well. So when you start cutting out glucose from your diet and sugars from your diet, you also start depleting a lot of the glycogen that's present in your liver and your skeletal muscle. So, and I forgot the exact ratio, but per every gram of glycogen, I think there's 3 or so grams. It's a 3 to 1, I think, of water to glycogen. So when you start taking away that glycogen, you're also taking away the water that comes with it, and that means you're going to lose a lot of that water weight. So what these researchers or what the investigators didn't quite have an opportunity to do was look at water weight. So lean body mass is a culmination of all these things: bone, tissue, and even water. So because they didn't use the 4-component model that others can use to derive lean body mass or total lean body mass, we don't know where this where this drop in lean body mass can be contributed to. But based on the fact that a lot of the science and people have already shown that with the ketogenic diet you're more prone to lose water weight very quickly, that's where we can assume this is coming from.
Yeah, that was really well explained. And what that tells us in terms of, one of the big questions from there is the lifting variables didn't change, right? They're lifting the same amount. They're consuming roughly the same amount. Their protein is about the same. So how in the world did they lose lean mass?
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're talking about. You have to be able to figure out these nuances of, is the ketogenic diet leading to a decrease in muscle mass? Are you actually losing muscle mass? And I would argue, based on the data, although they didn't report water, no, not so far. You're just seeing a drop in measured lean mass, but that could be because of the water just being robbed out of the musculature, which could definitely lead to a drop of 1.5 kilograms. That would be pretty standard.
But another thing to consider as well is, and you'll see this with, if anyone ever wrestled or did anything like that, one of the big ways that a lot of those people try to lose weight is by spitting, or they'll try to sweat it out, and pretty drastic measures that will actually mess around with your electrolyte balance and cause you to become severely dehydrated, leading to a multitude of different problems. So the nice thing with the thought of how water weight might be lost with this ketogenic diet, it doesn't seem to have an effect on electrolyte balance. And I think that's an important distinction between other ways in which people try to lose water weight for a meet or anything like that. So we're right, it's probably water weight, but the way in which they're doing it might be a lot healthier and easier on, say for example, the kidney and the liver to deal with. So it's not as drastic and as dangerous as these other methods that people use to drop water weight.
Yeah, it's essentially the body just doing what it needs to do. It's not like you're forcing it into a situation where it's being robbed of everything and it's just clinging on to every molecule of water that it can possibly find. Yeah, that's a really good point. Then, while looking at C, so moving on to C, you do see, again, you see some individuals that barely see any drop in fat mass. You see some people that gain fat. You see some people that, most people end up losing some fat, but that all ends up leading to the average being no change whatsoever. So you're looking at an overall trend there, and it's just nothing there. Fat mass for the normal diet, you saw an increase. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say to that.
I think this kind of goes back to why having that crossover design is so important, because the reason some of this could have existed was because of of the order of things. So, could the ketogenic diet could have potentiated what you'd see in the normal diet afterward, and vice versa. So, some of these people, so say for example for the usual diet, the people that gain fat mass, for example, could have been on the ketogenic diet before. So those were the people that were on the ketogenic diet for the first 3 months. And then the people that lost weight could have been on the usual diet first and the ketogenic diet after. That's just a speculation, but it kind of shows that the spread indicates there might have been an order effect, and obviously because it was all randomized, that effect was washed out with the amount of subjects that you had. If that makes any sense, hopefully. But
no, I understand what you mean. Yeah, I guess I definitely didn't consider that. I don't think I wrote down any notes on that. No, I didn't.
Catching you slipping, man.
That's why I have you on here, to keep me honest and to point out things that I definitely miss. Do you want to explain power to weight ratio?
So power to weight ratio is pretty much showing that what the amount of weight or the amount of weight they're lifting compared to the weight they're at. So it's pretty much showing I think in powerlifters they call it Wilks, but pretty much showing the amount of weight you're lifting per gram of body mass. Right. So, for these people, and this is kind of cool because it's driving home your point about how performance is not going down, but weight is going down. So where this weight's coming from. So for these individuals that were on the ketogenic diet, their power to weight ratio went up. So although they were losing weight, they didn't sacrifice any power. They didn't sacrifice performance because it was mainly staying the same despite the drop in weight. So that's the biggest thing. So basically what I'm saying is that the increase that you're seeing in the power to weight ratio is not driven by the increase in performance, it's driven by the drop in weight and no change in performance.
Yeah, exactly. So they just maintained their power output or their strength, and they dropped their weight from what we just talked about, the decrease in lean mass, most likely from drop in glycogen, which actually is interesting because it brings about this robustness of the body to be able to have this drop in glycogen but still be able to perform in powerlifting, right?
Yeah.
But that's most likely because of something I've spoken about before. It's probably because when you're doing a single repetition or maybe even 2 repetitions, you're using the phosphocreatine system for the most part. You're not going to be using a ton of glycogen. It's not like you're depleting glycogen over and over and over again. So Yeah, I mean, so here you see that most likely, if our speculations are correct, that you see a decrease in glycogen, that glycogen is not going to be a limiting factor for lifting as it relates to powerlifting and weightlifting. Lifting performance. So here you see, again, a lot of variability. You have 2 or 3 individuals that see an increase in percentage of lifting performance, but ultimately, overall, you see just about the same. So you see an increase in lifting performance with the normal diet and with the ketogenic diet, which kind of ends up leading to essentially no difference between the two groups. Anything you want to add there?
No, I think you kind of nailed it. Like, generally what you're seeing is like people that are going to, down but not statistically significant. It would have been cool to see if they stratified those individuals, but it does seem, from at least looking at it, that this no effect is being driven by the 3 people that are skyrocketing with the ketogenic diet. But based on their stats and everything they did, it's not statistically significant, so we can't say otherwise.
Yeah, right. Okay, and in terms of figures and tables, I think that is it. But I did want to add one more note, which is actually something that Alec texted me about, because I was ranting about it as well as I was reading this paper. And we talked about it earlier. I was kind of alluding to it. Where are there measures for ketones?
Yep.
I mean, you could say you're in a ketogenic phase that your body is in a ketogenic state, but you need to prove it. You absolutely need to prove it. So in that situation, you would want to show ketone measures, especially when they're taking blood already. They show glucose, they show potassium, and they show sodium, but they're just like, this is a ketogenic paper, but we're not going to bother showing the ketones. But they did have a single line in which they said, yeah, their ketones were elevated, which I found absolutely hilarious, because that really instilled a lot of faith in me that they know what they're doing, and I 100% believe them. They don't show the data that the ketones are elevated, so they could have been just slightly elevated, like 0.5 millimolar or something ridiculous like that, and they could have just not been in a ketogenic state this entire time, so the whole thing may have been a moot point.
That's fair. Yeah, and what effect? So and kind of seeing at that point how the data shaked out. If you had certain people that were in ketogenesis and certain people that weren't, how that affected their performance. Because there's a whole nother line of research that exists that looks at the effect of exogenous ketones. So if you supplement it with ketones themselves, what effect that has on your metabolism. And I think that's honestly quite interesting from my perspective, just because one of my big beefs I have with ketogenic diet and anything that really takes away and cuts out an entire macronutrient group from your diet is that it's very difficult to sustain. So certain people can do it. Certain people are okay being, saying eggs and bacon for the rest of my life. Great, like they can do that. But there are certain people that need to have carbohydrates, that need to, or if they're on this diet, they constantly feel hungry because carbohydrates are the most satiating thing for them. I'm for one of those people. I tried, low carbohydrate diets, and I always felt hungry. Granted, I always feel hungry anyway, but more so when I was on these type of diets, and I had a buddy that was the same way. And I don't mean to use these personal anecdotes as like a rationale for why I think, or to drive any of your decisions. But what I am saying is it should all be personalized. So you have to figure out what works for you. But one of the big beefs that a lot of people have with ketogenic diets is the fact that you're cutting out an entire macronutrient group, which is a problem. And that's why figuring out what the effect of just the ketones themselves, I think is more exciting for future research to conduct on. And I don't know if it'll ever be done in this arena, but it might be interesting as well.
Yeah, I got you. No, that makes complete sense, because then it would be nice to be able to consume essentially all the macronutrients and then have potential benefits of increased ketones without necessarily having your liver spitting out ketones
Yep.
and going through ketogenesis. With that said, let's jump into the conclusion. Like, what would you take away from this paper? Like, what do you feel comfortable concluding? What do you not feel comfortable concluding?
So, what I feel comfortable concluding, I mean, although the stats say no drop in performance. All right, I'll put it to you this way. If you're ever cutting for a meet, if you ever have to drop into a weight class, you can never say you're going to fully recover or keep your lifts at where they were. Some people can, some people can't. I think what this paper showed is that the ketogenic diet, even when you're losing weight, you do a decent job of being able to maintain your performance. So for short-term weight cutting for a meet, I think the ketogenic diet, if it's sustainable for you in that period of time, is an option, is a viable option. And it seems to do so, the mechanism that we're postulating is that it is by water weight. And the water weight you're losing is not detrimental to overall electrolyte balance and fluids balance, which is especially important, again, because obviously for the health of your kidney and everything else. So it seems to be dropping weight, potentially water weight, in a healthy manner that is not detrimental to your kidneys.
Yeah, exactly.
Or won't cause severe dehydration.
Yeah, so it's essentially a way, maybe even a better way, to drop water weight without compromising your lifts and without actively trying to dehydrate yourself, which could certainly have an impact on your lifting performance. So you're robbing your musculature of that water in using kind of physiological means that are considered relatively safe. Yeah, exactly. So any final thoughts before we jump into the next paper? I'm probably going to take 3 minutes before we jump into the next paper, but do you have anything else you want to add, or?
Nothing really. The one thing I did want to say is that, and I should have mentioned this in the methodology, is that they didn't really control for supplements these people were taking. So because this paper, again, we're speculating that relies on fluid balance. Lifters commonly take something like creatine, which is
a steroid.
Get out! Which one of the main mechanisms through it works is, one of the ways in which it works is being able to hold on to water weight and increase the water that's driven in the skeletal muscle, create the swelling effect. So that's obviously going to have a play here potentially. Caffeine, for example. Caffeine is a diuretic. So what effect that's having during this diet, and does consuming caffeine while on the ketogenic diet promote more water loss, or does it have any sort of other effects? So I would have liked to see here a little bit more attention to any supplements that lifters who probably are taking supplements and kind of controlled for that, or at least shown that they are tracking it during this during the 3 or 6 month periods.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. And I would say that if they had had a much larger sample size, that might have washed out, because you maybe have a few people that are on different supplements, but their sample size just isn't large enough to be able to.
For
if
sure.
you could, those, literally exactly what you were saying, like those 3 people, if it's the same 2-3 people that keep being opposed to the rest of the group is showing particular trends, and you have 2 or 3 people that are going the exact opposite direction. That could be because of something like that with supplements that they're not controlling for. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. That's a really good point. Okay, well, with that is the first paper, which is a bit simpler paper to cover. I'm going to take 4 minutes, and at 8:50, yeah, holy hell, it's already 8:50. At 8:50, we will jump into the next paper.